It's good to be back with everybody. It's been about a month. I hope everyone's doing well. We are going to be doing Second Samuel, and I'm really excited about this. Really excited about this chapter because, as a kind of a history nut, this one kind of speaks to me fairly strongly because there's some interesting things for us to kind of discuss and understand about what's going on that I think actually the chapter itself kind of leaves a lot of stuff out that I'm hoping to explain to you as we discuss it. Um, so we're gonna get right in. As you can see, my kid's not here with me, but so I am sorry that after a month you haven't got to see her. She'll be back soon though, so no worries. So like I said, we're just gonna do one chapter. We're gonna do all of chapter two. It's about 30 verses, and then we're gonna talk about it. And like I said, today I will warn you. Today is much more historical oriented, giving some context for what this is. A lot of times I do my best to, especially as I see it and it comes to me, to show more of a spiritual message. This one's a lot more kind of like history class, and I'm going to do my best to make it interesting. I love history, so I find it interesting. I'm going to try my best to make it interesting for you as well. So, starting at the beginning of chapter 2, in the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to the towns of Judah?" he asked. The Lord said, "Go up." David asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. So David went up there with his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. The men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah. Then David was told that it was the men from Jabesh Gilead who had buried Saul. He sent messengers to them to say to them, "The Lord bless you for showing this kindness to Saul your master, for burying him. May the Lord now show you kindness and faithfulness, and I too will show you the same favor because you have done this. Now then be strong and brave, for Saul your master is dead, and the people of Judah have anointed me king over them." Meanwhile, Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, Ashuri, and Jezreel, and also over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. Ishbosheth, son of Saul, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. The tribe of Judah, however, remained loyal to David. The length of time David was king in Hebron over Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Abner son of Ner, together with the men of Ishbosheth son of Saul, left Mahanaim and went to Gibeon. Joab son of Zeruiah and David's men went out and met them at the pool of Gibeon. One group sat down on one side of the pool, and one group on the other side. Then Abner said to Joab, "Let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us." "All right, then, let them do it," Joab said. So they stood up and were counted off, 12 men from Benjamin, and Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 for David. Then each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his dagger into his opponent's side, and they fell down together. So that place in Gibeon was called Helkath Hazarim. The battle that day was very fierce, and Abner and the Israelites were defeated by David's men. The three sons of Zeruiah were Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now Asahel was fleet-footed as a wild gazelle. He chased Abner, turning neither right nor left as he pursued him. Abner looked behind him and said, "Is that you, Asahel?" "It is," he answered. Then Abner said to him, "Turn aside to the right or to the left. Take on one of the young men and strip him of his weapons." But Asahel would not stop chasing him. Again Abner warned Asahel, "Stop chasing me. Why should I strike you down? How could I look your brother Joab in the face?" But Asahel refused to give up the pursuit. So Abner thrust the butt of his spear into Asahel's stomach, and the spear came out through his back. He fell there and died on the spot, and every man stopped when he came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died. But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner, and as the sun was setting they came to the hill of Ammah near Giah, on the way to the wastelands of Gibeon. Then the men of Benjamin rallied behind Abner. They formed themselves into a group and took their stand on top of a hill. Abner called out to Joab, "Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their fellow Israelites?" Joab answered, "As surely as God lives, if you had not spoken, the men would have continued pursuing them until morning." So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the troops came to a halt. They no longer pursued Israel, nor did they fight any more. All that night Abner and his men marched through Arabah. They crossed the Jordan and continued through the morning hours and came to Mahanaim. Then Joab pursuing Abner and assembled the whole army. Besides Asahel, 19 of David's men were found missing, but David's men had killed 360 Benjamites who were with Abner. They took Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb at Bethlehem. Then Joab and his men marched all night and arrived at Hebron by daybreak. And so, like I said, this is going to be a little bit more of a history lesson than maybe a spiritual message, although there's a little bit in here. Um, and so what we see here is we see that Judah declares um, David king of Judah, not of Israel, but of Judah. The rest of Israel at this point does not follow. And so the first thing we should talk about is just kind of why is that going on? So Saul was the king over all of Israel, not just one tribe, but all the tribes. And the best way to explain this is pretty common back in this day. Nationalities and overlordships and stuff back in this time were very fluid. To try and give, and this is going to sound terrible because this is still probably several hundred years old. Um, if you know any history of like France, especially like France and Normandy, back in the day, you say think of Age of William the Conqueror in that time. France was a kingdom, and Normandy was part of the kingdom, but it had a very long autonomous streak to where Normandy kind of self-ruled itself. Now they didn't call their person a king; they called their person a duke, and that person in some way gave fealty to France, but they were generally autonomous. And every once in a while, they'd sort of say, "Forget you, France. We're going to be king." And so this is kind of one of those places where there's a confederation of tribes, and they make Israel. But every once in a while, and for a period of time, one will break off and declare its own independence and have its own king, and that's really kind of normal back in this time. Um, Now, what's interesting is this distinction will continue on, as you know. Um, Eventually, we'll start to see two different tribes or two different kingdoms here, and they will stay two different kingdoms. We'll have Judah and we'll have Israel, which I believe becomes Samaria later on, or that's what they name themselves. And so we see that we already see there's that little bit of distinctive split. Now, why did Judah pick David? Well, David is from the tribe of Judah. I would say at this point he's likely the highest ranking person in Israel that's from Judah. So in King Saul's administration and kingdom, he was likely the highest ranking person that came from Judah. And then the last thing is given that Samuel came to David to anoint him, meaning they were most likely in Judah at the time, um, these people probably know about the anointing of David more than the rest of Israel. Remember, um, there was no internet, there was no Facebook, there was no telephones, there was no telegram. Really word of mouth was the way a lot of this stuff spread. So while we all know today about the anointing of David as king of Israel, the rest of Israel might not know this, but Judah probably did. And we do see in the previous couple chapters in First Samuel, and then in the chapter in chapter 1 of Second Samuel, we see where it seems like David's sort of preparing for the kingdom of Judah. And we know he sends gifts to them. And we also know that later on he orders them to learn this lament of Saul. And so we see here where he becomes king of Judah. Now, on the opposite side, we see Abner, who was Saul's general. We see him make Ishbosheth, one of Saul's sons, king of, as they say, Gilead, Ashuri, Jezreel, Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. And there's two interesting things. One, the fact that Abner makes him king is kind of iffy on its own. And there's a couple chapters later on where it seems like at times Abner gets a little ahead of himself. And the fact that he thinks he can probably make somebody king is showing that issue right here. But second off, it's interesting how they explain what Ishbosheth became king of. Gilead, Ashuri, Jezreel, Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. And what I think is happening here is I think that Gilead, Ashuri, Jezreel, Ephraim, and Benjamin absolutely declared him king of their tribes. Absolutely. Um, Declared fealty to him, said he was their king. What I think is likely where it then says, and all Israel, is I think that maybe his hold on the rest of Israel really wasn't that tight. And in fact, it wouldn't shock me if the rest of Israel is kind of being silent about who they were going to be have their loyalties to between David and Ishbosheth. I kind of wonder if maybe Abner making him king of all Israel was sort of his way of trying to expand the kingdom, try and get more support, and show that he had a right to rule because Saul was the king of all Israel. But I'm a little dubious about how much he had hold over the tribes outside of the ones that are named here. I think probably it was tenuous at best that he ruled them. And so what we see here is we see what is, especially in the medieval times, and this isn't medieval times, but in ancient times, what would we define as a civil war. Two different powerhouses are going to fight each other. And that's what we have here. And what we see because one person is king of Judah and one is king over several tribes and then all Israel's, we see that there was probably a whole host of Israel that just stayed on the sidelines to wait this out to see who actually won. And so then what we have is we have this battle between Ishbosheth's people and David's people. And we really hear mostly about Abner on Ishbosheth's side and Joab for David. Joab, remember, is the son of one of David's brothers, Zariah. And like I said, we actually hear of three of the sons of Zariah. But Joab is the one that's the commander of the army for David. And so what we see here, and it doesn't at first explain that it's a battle. It almost just sounds like they all kind of came out and hung together around the pond. But what we actually see here is that they arrived, and then what we actually see is we see that they have a sort of a fight off. They get 12 men from one side, 12 from the other, and they're to fight each other. That is actually not, that is a shockingly common war tactic back in this period of time and in other times. The Romans didn't so much do it because the Romans just had massive forces, so they decided to fight everyone. But this is sort of a champion versus champion fighting. And the goal is to minimize the casualties while finding out who's going to win. And so you pick so many of your people, they pick so many of their people, and it becomes hand-to-hand combat. Now, what you're left to see here, what it seems to imply here, is that they have that battle. They pick 12 on each side, and it almost seems like the 12 on each side kill themselves almost at the same time, where none of the 12 are left on either side. So 24 people would now be dead. And then it seems like there must have been a battle, because we hear about killing, we hear about fighting, we hear about the battle lasting for a long time. And at some point, I believe we are to assume that Joab's forces for Judah eventually put into a rout Abner's army for Ishbosheth. And so the Benjaminites and the whole group of Israel that's with them flee from Joab and Judah. And it seems like they are pursuing them for a long time. And then we hear about this fight between Asahel and Abner. And Asahel is just fixed in this retreat on getting to Abner and capturing him. And that kind of makes sense. It does seem like Abner is the power behind the king, Ishbosheth. And so in some ways, it's very highly likely that if you get Abner, you win the war. It's over. This is sort of like capturing the king on a chessboard, although he wasn't king. You win this one, it's over. Maybe this is more like capturing the queen on a chessboard, where if you capture that one valuable piece, the rest of the game's over because they just can't hold together. It's something to that effect. And we see that Asahel is running like a gazelle, catching up to him, and Abner actually in some ways is saying, stop, go to one of the young men, grab their stuff, and instead Asahel says, no, I'm going to get you. And Abner almost says, please stop so I don't have to kill you. And he keeps pursuing him. And then Abner kills him. And this almost sounds like Asahel, despite being a very fast person, they call him as fast as a gazelle. It almost seems like Asahel here got just over his skis with a person who was way better at fighting than he was. And this is one of the things where maybe his skill in pursuing him overtook his ability to actually fight him when he did. And he just was not ready to fight Abner. We then see they come up to Azahel's dead body and they pause. And it seems like they keep on pursuing. And we're left to this battle, or we're left to this stalemate that occurs where the men of Benjamin come to a hill with Abner and protect him. And likely what they created was some sort of what they call a shield wall back in medieval times. They likely got on top of the hill, circled it, and then locked shields and held themselves in that position. And that becomes a very impenetrable, very hard position to take. And to beat a shield wall in that way, it takes overwhelming men, especially if they're on top of a hill. It's going to kill a lot of people in the process. And so what we see here is we see Abner, who in this moment of wisdom gives us this quote that he says this to Joab. He says, "Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their fellow Israelites?" And Joab says, "If you hadn't spoken, we would continue pursuing till the morning." But it seems like they pause. And I think that is some really good words of wisdom. Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? And how long before your men stop pursuing their fellow Israelites? It's very, very, very wise, especially from a man who's considered a general, who was bred in war. There's a quote from a movie that I love. Not a lot of people have heard about it, but it's a great movie. It's called Crimson Tide. It's about a submarine during kind of the very end of the Cold War. And there's a point where the captain looks at his second in command, and they're very different. One's kind of from the old school gun hunter. The other one's much more of the Ivy League kind of new school way of thinking. And the captain looks at his second in command and says, "Who's the enemy? You know, are the Russians the enemy? Who's the actual enemy that we fight?" And he says, "I believe that war itself is an enemy." And what he was actually saying was that the war machines that they built were meant to protect us from going to war, not used as a means to fight a war. And I think that's very interesting, that the fact that he considered war itself the enemy. And I think we can expand that to say war is absolutely the enemy, but generally speaking, overall, especially when it's useless, conflicts, I think, are the enemy. Now, don't get me wrong. We're going to disagree. We're going to have fights. There are just wars out there. And there are times when we must stand up and we must fight. But I got a feeling that in our day and age, and if you want to go and look in Facebook and start counting them out, the amount of conflicts that are actually worthwhile are probably very few and far between. And frankly, most of the time when it comes to conflicts, when it comes to wars amongst ourselves in our current culture wars that seems like we're fighting all the time, most of them are not worth our breath, they're not worth our time, they're not worth our attention. And frankly, we should just let them go. Does the sword have to devour forever? Our tongues are typing, our words can be swords. Fighting can be more than just with a sword in battle. We seem to be fighting a lot of wars with our tongues these days, and we need to stop that cycle. We need to be more understanding and loving to each other, and understand that we can have conflicts. Understand that we can disagree, and we can disagree without being disagreeable. Actually, one of the most interesting things, and like I said, I'm a nerd, so I do apologize. But one of the things I love so much is, if you've ever heard of it, Robert's Rules of Order. Most major organizations, including our Congress, our West Virginia legislature, most formal meetings are ran by Robert's Rule of Order. And the entire intent of Robert's Rule of Order is to allow for a meeting that allows for the expression of disagreeing views without making it personal and disagreeable. And so there's some rules. For example, you don't actually address each other directly, or to direct to direct all your speech to a speaker, so it doesn't look like you're personally attacking a specific person. You got to let that person speak their whole part before the next person speaks. A person should not intervene in your speech, and if they do, they're actually to stay silent for the rest of the meeting. There's various rules, and the whole concept is to allow for all the ideas, even if they're in conflict, to be out there without actually causing personal strife, so that at the end of the day, you can come up with the best decision. And when you leave out that door, personal feelings are not broken and that you don't burn bridges. It's very wise. The person that came up with Robert's Rules of Order was very wise in what their attempt to do was. And for the most part, while it sounds confusing, if you've ever heard a meeting ran by true Robert's Rules of Orders, while at times it sounds very confusing, it is very effective at getting a lot of things done. If not, you're just kind of talking over each other. And so I think it's that Robert's Rules of Order, what we hear Abner talking about, these are things that lead to us to say we can have disagreements. We don't have to be on the same side for everything, um, but we do need to be show humanity, humility, and love and understanding to each other, or else we're going to continue to devour ourselves. Now, and I want to remind you, especially in this position where Abner's trying to plead with Joab not to fight, I think it is really worth remembering that Israel just recently gotten annihilated by the Philistines in the battle that Saul was killed in and his sons. They're probably pretty weak, and now they're going to get ready to fight a battle amongst themselves and kill amongst themselves. They are, if they continue to fight each other, they are ripe for invasion from somebody else, whether it's the Philistines further in or somebody else. Um, they were in a weak position, and so Abner comes out with this and says, "The sword devours forever. This is going to end in bitterness." Those are true things. And I think we should remember when we're fighting each other, especially when we're being disagreeable, when we're trying to one up each other, when we're taking every shot that we see on Facebook, every shot we hear on email or even in face, when we take each one of them personally and we don't just let it go, but we push back, um, we're likely continuing that battle. We're continuing that bitterness. And that doesn't end well for any of us in the end. We need to be understanding. We need to hear people out. There are times when we have to stand our ground and say, this is wrong. I disagree. But we still need to do it firm and loving. And there's no reason for us to push anyone in a way that's personally, in a way that's going to end in bitterness. Always leave a person a place to reconcile. That's important. That's absolutely important in our world. And so we need to remember this as we go forward. Like I said, I'm sorry if this one got a little nerdier than most. I really enjoyed this one, but I thought, especially at the end where they're talking about conflict and bitterness, I thought that was crucial to kind of really spend some time on that. And so I think we need to remember that as we go throughout this week and through our lives. Remember that we don't want everything to end in bitterness. We need to show love and compassion and understanding for everyone, especially those who we might be disagreeing with. Well, let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for just letting us get back here. Thank you for all the love and kindness you've given to us. Help us to not conflict with each other, or at least let us have conflicts without leaving it in just a spot where we can't reconcile ourselves. Let us not leave things in bitterness, but in a way of reconciliation. Help us to always leave that out. Help us to do our best to not even get in that position, but by being able to disagree, but doing it respectfully, kindly. There's ways for us to help prove our point, to help persuade, without being overbearing, without being bitter, without trying to almost conquer the person into our train of thought, and help us to just show that love and kindness as we go through our lives. Be with us as we go throughout this week. Please be with anyone out there who needs you, and help them to find you wherever they are. I ask for these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thank you guys. But again, by way of announcements, 10:45 every Sunday is when we have our worship service. You are always more than welcome to come. We will hope to see you there. We are still showing everything online, so you can do that as well. We will again be back here next week at 6 p.m. And so I hope you will come and join us back there. Like I said, I'm really excited about 2 Samuel. As I was getting ready to prepare for 2 Samuel, I realized that I didn't remember near as much about it as I thought. And so I think this is going to be a really good chapter. It's going to be a really good chapter for me, or for a really good book for me, because it's good for me to kind of relearn all this stuff. So have a great evening, everyone, and I hope to see you here next week. Bye, guys.